our seminar entitled The New Fascist Body. I'm sharing some general guidelines for our discussion. The speaker will talk for 40 minutes, followed by two talks from our respondents, each lasting 20 minutes. So then we will open the floor for the debate. It's my great pleasure to introduce our scholars today. Dagmar Herzog she is Distinguished Professor of History at Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She has published many essays and books on history of sexuality, German culture, European culture. And I'd like to mention her latest book, The Question of Unworthy Life, Eugenics and Germany's 20th Century. Then we have Lorenzo Benadusi. He's Professor of Contemporary History at University of Roma. His work analyzes history of sexuality, gender, but also European culture and Italian culture. And among his works, I'd like to mention The Enemy of the New Man, Homosexuality in Fascist Italy. And then another important work, Respectability, this difficult word to say in English, and Violence, Military Values, Masculine Honor, and Italian Road to Mass Death. Darcy Buerkle, she is Professor of History at Smith College. Her research focuses on modern European women's and gender history, with an emphasis on German and German Jewish women's intellectual and cultural history. She's the author of a number of publications, and in 2023, she co-edited a volume published by University of Wisconsin Press with Sky Dunny entitled Contemporary Europe in the Historical Imagination.
All right, here's my opening thing. Let's see if I know how to do it. Yes, I do. Okay, good. All right. The far-right party, Alternative für Deutschland, entered the German Bundestag in 2017 and has been doing scarily well. Its politics might be described as a kind of postmodern fascism, or fascism 3.0, as Sven said yesterday. It's postmodern in the sense that it is cleverly self-reflexive and plays with gleeful outrageousness with the inevitable contestedness and instability of truth. It's fascist or fascist adjacent in that it is viscerally hostile to the precious ideals of human equality and solidarity, and viciously cruel towards all those it identifies as vulnerable, in that it proliferates racialized explanations for what are actually more complicated economic and social dynamics, and not least, in that it powerfully appeals to narcissistic longings for greatness. Its primary unifying ethos is racism against migrants. But another significant part of the party's success involves its so-called family values posturing, even as it also, in only seeming contradiction, luxuriates provocatively in deliberate sexiness. There are overt echoes here with Nazism's, as you can see, very similar mix of racism and erotic incitements. The playful contradictoriness, moreover, is highly functional. It's not a problem, it's part of why it's effective, as it expands potential audiences, keeps opponents guessing, entertains with shrewd humor, and provides ready deniability in case of critical rebuke. Depending on context, the party styles itself as anti-gay and pro-gay. Actually, there's a whole new phenomenon now of Stolzmonat as an alternative to gay pride, which is pride in being part of the German folk. It celebrates traditional families and jokingly advocates teen sex. It celebrates both sensual and virtuously proper white motherhood, and it portrays girls in skimpy bikinis as well as buxom barmaids. And it invokes the threat of rape by men of color, as it simultaneously takes the opportunity to display female nudity in public spaces. For instance, in 2019, 5 years ago now, 6 years ago soon, in a large outdoor billboard repurposing the Clark Art Museum painting The Slave Market, Léon Gérôme, together with the tagline, "So that Europe does not become Eurabia." As the feminist art historian Linda Nochlin pointed out decades ago about this category of painting, white men got to look at lovely naked flesh and feel indignantly morally superior to men of color at the same time. The motif, as you can see by the contrast here, was not so different from the many in the Nazi Der Stürmer, which attracted gaggles of teens and other voyeurs, as it was always displayed in glass cases in town squares, and which regularly featured a naked, buxom blonde being violated by Jewish men or by snakes with Jewish names. And it's interesting, 5 years later, I'm sorry I don't have a picture of this, but the tone has changed from this kind of sexy racism to a new kind of schadenfreude, pleasure and cruelty, because the term remigration has now become socially acceptable. And there's a song, you can look it up, called Remigration Hit, with a video to go with it, which has basically abjected brown and black men in stereotypical bling-bling sort of immigrant clothes being herded by strong, Aryan, beautiful pilots and sexy, buxom women dancing onto planes and being flown by the hundreds out of the country. And then people are partying afterwards because they got rid of them. So there's a new escalation, I would say, in the kind of sexy racism. However, in addition to this distinctive sexy racism, there's one further distinctive element to AFD politics, and that's its anti-disability messaging. No other far-right party in the world is obsessed with disability the way the AFD is. Borrowing from the anti-disability playbook, well developed already before the Nazis, but elaborated by them with massive propagandistic investment and special ferocity, time-honored strategies of stirring emotions, above all disgust, and economic worries. This combination was especially evident in a formal inquiry, Anfrage, to the government in 2018 with regard to the utterly fabricated issue of migrant families supposedly producing disproportionately more children with cognitive impairments because of the, again, imaginary prevalence of, quote, incestuous marriage between blood relatives among the refugees. It took me a while to understand that this anti-Muslim claim was literally grafted onto an older anti-Semitic trope, you can see here, from the 1920s, in which it was contended that Jews produced more cognitively disabled offspring than Gentiles due to their prevalence of marriages between blood relatives. Yet the AFD's most consistent animus is directed against inclusion of children with disabilities in mainstream schools. Apparently, this has turned into the single most objectionable aspect of the only so recently won rights for people with disabilities secured when Germany ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2009. What deep-seated insecurities about the citizenry's intelligence might cause the expectation of sustained proximity, children with and without disabilities spending time together, to become such a bone of contention? Already, the first party platform in 2016 objected not just that inclusion would incur significant expenses, but also that it would, quote, hamper other children in their learning successes. AFD politicians, you can see that here, campaigned avidly on a reinstatement of what they called the achievement principle and an end to what they derisively described as a cuddle curriculum. One politician notoriously went so far as to assert that if children with Down syndrome spent time together in class with, I put my quotation marks, everybody see my quotation marks? Yeah, I'm distancing myself, normal, healthy pupils, it was akin to placing people with severe contagious diseases in a hospital ward together with non-infected patients. In endless variations, in one regional party platform after another, inclusion is attacked. And inclusion is not actually happening in German schools, so it's a kind of preemptive counter-revolution, but it's attacked as like the crucial problem that is keeping German intelligence back. The AFD is determined to push children with disabilities out of sight into the segregated special schools and keeping them invisible. Okay, what does this contrapuntal little subplot, but I think symptomatic, of spiteful unkindness have to do with the sexual politics of fascism, present or past? Question mark. Or, to put the question differently, what are we missing about the complex political and emotional work done by Nazism and other fascisms if we leave anti-disability animus out of our analyses? Beginning to find answers requires us to reach back to developments before the Third Reich, not just into Weimar, but further back than that, at least into the 1890s. And notably, I was very struck by this, reading the comments from the 60s. This was what George Mosse was insisting from the outset to his skeptical interlocutors in Stanford, right? He said, we have to go back to the 1890s. As I've discovered, however, finding answers means as well having to peel away successive layers of post-World War II bad faith and mendaciousness, even as the post-1945 misconstruals with regard to Nazi eugenic visions appear to be impelled by somewhat different dynamics than those prompting successive post-war generations for so long to have misrecognized the nature of Nazism's sexual politics. So we all know Mosse assumed that Nazism was predominantly respectability fixated. It's not true. And the 68ers believed wrongly that the Third Reich was sexually repressive for almost everyone. But in both cases, in the politics of sex and the politics of disability, the churches, Christian churches, and especially the Protestants, played vital and I think still underappreciated roles in rewriting the reality of the Nazi past. Okay, so here's my section, The Promise of Pleasure. So what is it that we have by now collectively researched extensively, and what do we think we understand about sex in the Third Reich? I would highlight 7 points. Point number 1, Nazism was not nearly as sexually restrictive and oppressive as was long believed for non-disabled, heterosexual, quote, Aryans, but then that's the majority of the population. Point 2, on the contrary, no prior regime in history had ever so systematically set itself the task of stimulating and validating especially young people's heterosexual desires, all the while denying precisely that this is what it was doing. The regime put itself in the role of permission giver. A core message was, as Slavoj Žižek once perceptively noted in a different context, you may, du darfst, right? Or as already at the time, Herbert Marcuse, working for the OSS, had observed, through its desublimating encouragements to break with restraint and tradition, the regime tied the young emotionally yet more directly to the state. So point 3, a key task is to explore how this combination of incitement, you may, and disavowal, we're not telling you that, worked. And part of the answer I found is that Nazi propagandists operated in a kind of triangular force field with Jews and Christians, demonizing and derogating whatever smacked of, quote, dirty Jewish sex, while ridiculing as laughably uptight all that was associated with the inherited Christian value system. And yet, here comes another contradiction, simultaneously also repurposing and borrowing from the Christian moral vocabulary of guilt and sin, but adapting it to issues of race and folk. Point 4, yes, Nazis also pervade sexual conservatism. So depending on the different constituencies they were addressing, or also depending on the messenger, depending on the occasion. And as they did so, another conspicuous oddity in all the cacophony was the way in which not a few of those non-Jewish Germans who were eager to restore more traditional mores accused their fellow non-Jews of behaving as though they were Jews, as though, this is the quote, Jewishness penetrated the Gentiles through to their erotic deep structure, erotische Tiefenschicht. Indeed, the one consistency in the welter of competing injunctions, pro-sex, pro-chastity, or muddled mixed messaging, is that all of them could be advanced through vicious anti-Semitism, including in the pictures and narratives in the ubiquitous Der Stürmer, anti-Semitic pornography. We cannot know who the viewers and readers of those scenarios identified with. Think about the booby woman lying there with the Jewish snakes all over. But we can comprehend both how they encouraged non-Jewish Germans to despise Jews without remorse, as well as how the claim to be battling filth provided a ready excuse to keep people's attention focused excitedly on sex. Yet, point 5, Nazism's appeal lay no less in a subtler aspirational dynamic. That is, in the positive, in a Foucauldian sense, and not just negative workings of power, as the regime proved remarkably effective in inserting itself into the most elemental desires for personal happiness. Quotidian emotional compartmentalization, we're all familiar with this nowadays, so it wasn't that different then, meant that the celebration of delightfully passionate romance could coexist perfectly comfortably with a racialized exclusionary worldview. as Alyssa Mailander, in her beautiful book of 2021, analyzed so lucidly, tens of millions of ordinary German and Austrian men and women experienced their lives in the Third Reich as satisfying and meaningful, an opportunity, as she puts it, for blossoming, épanouissement, for feeling themselves to be autonomous, self-determinately agentive, as securely belonging to the folk community, what she calls inclusionary racism, and as able to trust that their futures would be not just good, but radiantly so. Other scholars, too, you see them here, have documented, each with their own distinct emphases, how such powerful positive emotional attachment to Nazism could function. So special shout outs to Peter Fritschi, Nicholas Stargart, Raphael Gross, and Johann Chapoutot. Nonetheless, point 6, Nazism was also, concretely, about violent intrusiveness into that which is most intimate, into relationships, particularly Jewish, Gentile, and male homosexual relationships, and intrusive into bodies, destroying the capacity to reproduce in hundreds of thousands of fellow citizens, more on that in a moment, but also attempting to delve with a ferocious will to know into the innermost secrets of desire and orientation. These violent intrusions engaged ordinary men and women as they were invited to denounce, doxing people, right? Denounce fellow citizens and harass and cruelly mock and shame couples. An especially enlightening work has been done here by Michael Wild, Stefanie Schüler-Springorum, Patricia Zobar, and Alexandra Pichambal. And another way of thinking about this violently intrusive dimension of the Third Reich into relationships and into bodies is the way it provided an extraordinary opportunity matrix for professionals, with ambitious physicians eagerly taking the numerous chances the regime offered them to shift their research focus from chickens, rabbits, or mice onto suddenly massively available, excruciatingly vulnerable human beings. Scholars are, to this day, I mean, literally, as while we're here, striving to account more systematically for the still under-acknowledged extent of torturous medical experiments. Point 7. Meanwhile, the topic of Nazi homophobia has, in the past 30 years, spawned an impressive cottage industry. Was it about purported failure to live up to ideal standards of virility? Was it about non-participation in reproduction? Or about the Nazis' own anxiety about being perceived as queer? The regime sharpened paragraph 175, which criminalized male homosexuality, not only expanding it to include 175A, with its special provisions against sex with minors and abusive relations of dependency, but also widening the law's application to include even, quote, erotic glances. Denunciations and blackmailing were rampant. 100,000 men were arrested, 50,000 convicted, many sent to prisons, 10 to 15,000 to concentration camps, and between 5,000 and 10,000 died. What was it in the end really all about? And what can we learn from comparativist studies examining persecution of same-sex seeking men in other national contexts? With regard to Germany, what I want to emphasize most is the initially counterintuitive finding that in this supposedly most biology-enthralled regime, desire and orientation, or the Germans said Triebrichtung, drive direction, in the terms of the time, were understood not as inborn and unchangeable, as the preeminent Weimar sex researcher Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a major hate object for the Nazis, both for his Jewishness and his extraordinary generosity toward human idiosyncrasy in all matters of intimacy, insisted. Rather, the experts who ascended in the course of the Third Reich specifically advanced social constructionist theories of orientation as fluid and labile. While these innovative perspectives could have been used for anti-homophobic purposes, they in fact facilitated the expansion and radicalization of prosecutions and of planned torment, as the perpetual concern for sorting out what was believed to be only a tiny 2% minority of, quote, true homosexuals from the vast majority of, quote, pseudo-homosexuals that, it was hoped, had been only temporarily derailed in their drive direction, providing professionals like the psychotherapist and inventor of autogenic training, Johannes Schulz, with opportunities to observe men convicted of same-sex activity being forced to attempt heterosexual coitus and on this basis to adjudicate their fates. Not irrelevantly, moreover, a main legacy of Nazi sexual politics for the post-war, post-45, would in fact be this novel paradigm of fluidity and malleability of desire and drive direction, with pernicious consequences as the, quote, bisexual lability, the idea that men could go either way, and the homosexual responsiveness, I put this in quotes, purportedly so dangerously pervasive among young men, was used in the post-war by conservative Christians as reasons for supporting continuing criminalization of homosexuality. And of course, precisely the persistence of Nazi-exacerbated popular prejudice and the ongoing prosecutions was what seriously delayed scholarly research. The study of same-sex seeking women, lesbians were criminalized formally under Austrian law, denounced and persecuted via more indirect paths in Nazi Germany, has meanwhile advanced enormously due to pioneering research Claudia Schopman, Anna Heikova, Camille Faurou, Samuel Haneke, and many others. The study of trans and gender nonconforming individuals, not subsumable under the rubric of homosexuality, is just now getting underway, with particularly important interventions from Laurie Marhofer and Xavier Nunn, and adding insightful points about the ultimate indeterminacy of identities and meanings from Jennifer Evans and Alyssa Mailander. What can we conclude? One succinct summary might read like this. Already by the early 1900s, German culture had been arguably the most sex liberal in the world. What would be new about the dynamics in Weimar was twofold. Jews were suddenly perceived to be in charge of the nation's sexual culture via their roles both in medicine and in print media. And, paradoxically, the ideal of sexual happiness was evidently very widely yearned for, also by millions of Gentiles, who eagerly sought the information that mainly Jewish sex advice writers were providing. Conservative Christians, Catholic and Protestant alike, fretted constantly that their control over their flocks was eroding. The Nazis acquired gushing support from the churches by portraying themselves initially as the restorers of conservative tradition, but within 2 to 3 years, by 1935-36, dismayed the churches by brazenly advertising themselves as the new pleasure givers, putting themselves in the very place of the Jewish sex rights activists they had driven into exile. Taken aback, caught off guard, Catholic and Protestant spokesmen alike, in that continually recalibrated triangular relationship with Nazis and Jews, so Christians, Nazis, Jews, kept trying to promote their own more conservative values as a contrast, literally, to both anti-Semitic, i.e. Nazi, and Semitic, i.e. Jewish mores, to no avail. It was the combination of shrill indignation at the sex coded as unclean and Jewish, albeit, as I noted, accompanied by titillating images of full-bosomed blondes, innocent about to be violated maidens, and opulently detailed narratives of sexual crimes. So shrill indignation on the one hand, with robust injunctions to shake off inherited bourgeois values and religious distrust of sexual joy that was the distinctive innovation of Nazism, right? Indignation and injunctions. The seeming contradiction, accusing Jews of undermining proper mores while railing against Christian church-induced unmanly prudish dishonesty, proved exceptionally functional for the regime. Meanwhile, the all-pervasive anti-Semitic messaging that blamed Jews for immorality also offered legitimation for that other pleasure, the pleasure in cruelty, taken by those who violently humiliated individuals caught pursuing love or sex across the previously traversable, but from 1933 on savagely demarcated Jewish-Gentile divide. I'm halfway through. Okay, next part. The longing to be a folk that is strong, beautiful, and smart. Okay, here we go. Yet, what happens when we expand our developing sense of the already intricate three-way dynamic of Nazis, Christians, Jews, to add an attention to a fourth, partly intersecting group, those Germans deemed so intellectually disabled or psychologically disturbed that they should be deprived of the right to reproduce, or indeed to stay alive at all? And with regard to meaning-making around this topic of disability, of human imperfection, how do we even get at that elusive but exceedingly consequential phenomenon George Mosse shorthanded as attitude of mind? It's hard to know how to compress a story that has many hyperlinks. We can talk about this after the responses. but two matters seem important to flag up front. First, there turns out actually to be, if we go back to the 1890s, a quite direct historical link, in other words, an affective suture between deadly malice towards people with disabilities and that promise of transgressive libidinal pleasure that was to become such a significant part of Nazism's popular appeal. Okay, malice and transgressive pleasure. Second, the Christian care providers who were the prospective defenders of the rights of people with disabilities, I mean the would-be anti-Nazis as it were, even as they sought to provide some alternate conceptual frames, ended up already by the mid-1920s at the latest, and certainly by the early 30s, in other words, before the Third Reich, late Weimar, before Hitler comes to power, the Christians, for overdetermined reasons of their own, defensiveness, ambivalence about the people in their care, maybe also a feeling of disinhibition or an ambition to repurpose eugenic language for agendas of their own, the Christians ended up confirming and reinforcing the sense that disability was a legitimate focus for disgust and both a biological and an economic danger to the folk community. Each of these matters rested on what should be a paradox, but alas isn't. Eugenics was based on completely flawed premises. On closer inspection, much of it consists of subjective presumptions, bluffing declarations, and wishful thinking, yet it held enormous prestige and attraction for many. Most importantly, by conferring moral validity to those slipshod rationalizations of anti-disability sentiment, the Christian charity spokesman, Protestants particularly, would in due time greatly ease popular acceptance of Nazi propaganda and policy, including the coercive sterilization program in which the Protestants would play a major role. Christians, in short, actively contributed to what Mosse summarily described as preconditioning, emotional preparation. So, here we go. On the first matter, as of the 1890s, as Mosse said, this is what we have to go back to, it was becoming socially acceptable in Germany to express death wishes towards people with intellectual impairments or psychiatric illnesses. And Christian charity spokespeople were already acknowledging worry. Two groups in particular were targeted: the long-term institutionalized and significantly impaired newborns. Popular dramatist Otto Ernst, for instance, just to take one example of many, here we go, challenged the directors of religious charity institutions, those are the ones providing the bulk of daily care, to admit that they themselves had troubling doubt about the life value of individuals with disabilities. And in 1902, he contended with regard to the long-term institutionalized that Jehovah regrets that he created these. Also, Jehovah freut es, dass diese schuf. Ernst proposed bluntly, all embedded in iambic pentameter, very flowery poetry, that God himself would be most grateful if human beings would take on the task of killing the disabled on his behalf, God's behalf. Diverse rationales were taking shape. One was pity, best captured in the oft-cited aphorisms of Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote of a disabled infant that it would be, quote, more cruel to let it live than to kill it. A second was based in cost-benefit utilitarianism, promoted by a psychologist, Adolf Jost. Yet no conceptual touchstone would be more compelling to more people than the dream of racial perfectibility advanced by zoologist Ernst Haeckel, best known to us, you see them here, for his drawings of sea anemones, so gorgeous that they literally inspired Art Nouveau, who revived the story, once told by Plutarch, of the ancient Spartans said to have left their weak and deformed children to die on Mount Taygetus. This habitual practice in Ernst Haeckel's enthused rendering, he first said it in 1868 and then repeatedly thereafter, was the key to the Spartan race's exquisite strength and efficiency. And then it was Alfred Plötz, biologist and the coiner of racial hygiene, Rassenhygiene, as the German term for the Anglo-American eugenics, who in 1895 amplified the significance of the soon-to-be ubiquitously invoked, it's a shorthand, the Spartans, people would refer to them, not only by dwelling in vivid further detail on their infanticidal practices, but also by presenting them as transgressively inspirational in their sexual customs, as pre- and extramarital intercourse were not just permitted, but celebrated when these were believed likely to produce healthy and also expressly intelligent offspring. In short, a potent, erotically supercharged emotional conceptual connection was being forged between the ancient practice of infanticide and the aspirational ideal that the Germanic people would become by continually killing off the deformed and weak, strong and beautiful and smart. Plutz's vision was to become Nazi policy. And in the meantime, the numbers of the vulnerable kept rising. This is how you can sort of imagine what it was like. By 1910, there would be 34,000 individuals living in institutions for the, quote, feeble-minded. Another 25,000 children were in remedial schools in 270 German towns. Germany is precocious in providing special education and precocious in institutionalizing. Crucially, moreover, these turn into entire counterworlds to modernity, right, these villages. Crucially, moreover, and while all participants in the discussions over intellectual disability long since reflexively hierarchized human worth, then there's mutual rivalry between the special ed teachers and the institution directors over the more exciting children to work with. They fight with each other, but they are already readily distinguishing between the mildly or moderately impaired, who were at least educable or trainable on the one side, and the regrettably unable to work, quote, care cases, the German word is Pflegefälle, on the other, the latter of whom were typically denied any therapeutic engagement, even as they might well make up a third or even a half of these institutions' charges. And by the 1910s, yet another escalating conversation was getting underway in which self-appointed experts mused about whether it was 1% to 2% or 10 or perhaps 20 or even 30% of the German populace who should be considered, quote, permanently unsuitable for the production of offspring. It's a third of the German populace. The statistical controversy itself concretized the notion that repulsive infirmity within the nation was both enormous and real. The total of Germans whose reproduction was considered undesirable, one expert opined, summarizing the evolving state of debate in 1931, was at the very minimum 6 million. So this is the context in which the fictions and fantasies of a eugenicist paradigm were taking hold. I need some water. I'm just gonna, can I do this? Yeah. I'll be right back with you. Why was there so much disability, especially cognitive? In 85 to 90% of cases, a best short answer would be poverty, plus the untreatable diseases of toddlerhood amidst demographic growth and rapid industrialization and urbanization. You have to imagine the fevers, encephalitis, meningitis. There are no antibiotics. Even though leading scientists and public health experts knew full well, and some stated openly, that feeble-mindedness, or there's the newly coined category of psychopathological inferiority, we could all get this diagnosis, it's totally subjective, only seemed biologically inherited because poverty was replicating across the generations. A mashup of victim-blaming ideas were popularized in ever more inventive variations. What motive forces drove the plausibility of these constructs, or the wish to believe in them, and why would the notion that cognitive deficit was definitively hereditary, rather than environmentally induced or random, be doubled down on with such vigor? A brief answer would appear to lie in the narcissistic injury of German defeat in World War I. So there's eugenics everywhere. Germans are the ones who lose the war. Experienced as a national humiliation. Indeed, I've started to think that we might usefully understand the suddenly rapid diffusion of a eugenic worldview in Germany, particularly the insistent propagation of the fiction of inherited disability as a second Durchstoßlegende, the anti-Semitic stab-in-the-back myth that instead of acknowledging that the Imperial German army had been trounced on the battlefield, blamed the defeat on the machinations and betrayals of social democrats and Jews on the home front. Versions of eugenics, after all, were internationally influential, not least in the US and UK, as we're constantly reminded, we're constantly defensively told, but everybody did it, including the Americans. But I would note that the totally different discussion among Italian eugenicists showcases the non-necessary, non-inevitable direction that Germany took. What was unusual in the German discussion were three other elements, all connected to the military defeat. The euthanistic, death-wishing inflections of the national discussion in Germany. In other words, the thought that the best way to solve what was at best a care crisis was by systematically eliminating those most needful of care. The histrionic assessments that the size of the problem and the conviction that the literal survival of the nation was at stake, including the most fundamental, quote, ability to feel pride in being a German, that's the psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin. And thirdly, in due course, the very particular, what I would call theo-biopolitical, sex-fixated interventions put forward by the Protestants. The whole conversation, this euthanistically inflected eugenics, took shape largely in reaction to one slim book published in 1920, Permission to Annihilate Life Unworthy of Life, co-authored by the jurist Karl Binding and the psychiatrist Alfred Hoche. Although, as noted, you've learned this by now, or you knew it already, death wishes against the disabled have been circulating for a while. Binding and Hoche's provocation shifted the terms dramatically, as they bluntly demanded killing of the people they referred to as the incurable idiots. But above all, what's novel about them is that they proffer a concrete proposal for how the individuals to be killed should be selected. This, quote, life unworthy of life, which is their indelible coinage, ballast existences that lacked all affection value. They have no Affektionswert, you can't love them. There's no question that Binding and Hoche would serve as the template for Nazi euthanasia, in other words, the disability murders. Meanwhile, already in the 1920s, some prominent theologians and religious educators, not themselves caregivers, actually agreed that people with disabilities should be killed. But what can we learn from those who objected to the call to kill? I would suggest that responses to Binding and Hoche's pamphlet from those Christians directly involved in charity care work, showing the difficulties they had in coming up with persuasive counterarguments about why not kill, can be among the most revelatory for us as we seek to understand how a eugenic worldview came to be absorbed far more widely. Most strikingly, Protestant charity spokesmen took the occasion of attempting to rebut Binding and Hoche to vent their only seemingly unrelated frustrations about the rising liberalization in popular sexual values and practices, and the way, as a charity director from Sachsen-Anhalt put it, quote, the media Jews, die Pressejuden, were encouraging loosening sexual mores among the masses. Because the Jews are encouraging people to be more sexually free, that's why we have so much disability. Insultingly reaffirming the idea that people with disabilities were repellent, I now quote a Christian, quote, vegetating clumps of flesh whose expressions of life consist in nothing more than eating, drinking, eliminating, and sleeping. One charity director, the PhD in theology, phrased it, as he listed as well his familiarity with, quote, micro and hydrocephalics, mongoloids, and epileptics. The Christians developed florid theories that proliferating sexual immorality was the main direct cause of so much intellectual disability in the nation. In other words, idiocy and sin were tightly connected. When leading members of the Protestant Intermission met in the town of Treise, near Frankfurt, in 1931 in order to formulate a welfare policy platform, they roundly rejected euthanasia. In other words, they reject Binding and Hoche's call to kill, but they accepted sterilization, at this point still imagined as voluntary. In a resolution promulgated at the meeting's conclusion, they declared, quote, the hereditary factor, de Erbfaktor, to be the source of a staggeringly large share of the mental infirmities evident among their facilities residents. In other words, they've learned to say that this is biologically inherited, even though they knew full well that it wasn't. And once more, there were side swipes at the sexual culture of Weimar. Quote, brothel keepers, it was stressed, were far worse vermin than the physical and mental invalids. And yet, and although Binding and Hoche, cited by name, were repudiated for assuming that there was, quote, no soul life among the severely disabled, nonetheless, the aversion that Binding and Hoche had articulated against individuals with disabilities was yet again confirmed and reincited. In other words, the case for keeping the disabled alive was that doing so provided a valuable lesson in chastity for the non-disabled. In other words, that vision of disgust will keep you sexually well-behaving. 2 years later, Protestants involved in disability care warmly welcomed the arrival of the Third Reich, So these are two famous institutions, one in Hamburg, one in Bavaria, and you can see that in the basket weaving workshop, there is a swastika being woven into the basket, and down there's a little picnic with the deaconesses, and they have swastikas on their flags. Okay? In fulsome terms, directors embraced the rise of Nazism, expressing appreciation that the new government had effectively, quote, broken the influence of that Jewish liberalism that is totally hostile to the gospel. And once the Nazis' coercive sterilization law of July 33 went into effect, Protestants began enthusiastically to sterilize. Christians' deep enmeshment in this particular Nazi mass crime would come to be a factor, long unacknowledged but signally pertinent, in the decades of aggressively refused recognition faced by sterilization survivors in the post-war. Catholics, of course, registered vigorous formal objections to sterilization, but they ultimately accommodated the sterilizations amongst their flocks. And the anguish and distress experienced by and often urgently, eloquently articulated by those targeted for the surgeries was immense and continues to deserve far more sensitive analysis. Nonetheless, only 2 additional years hence, Protestants would find themselves no less dismayed than Catholics as they discovered that Nazis had actually no intention of enforcing any return to traditional sexual mores, but were apparently set on reintroducing the very, quote, culture of nakedness they had claimed they would abolish. How had this misunderstanding about Nazi intentions come to pass, not least after all that helpful assistance Protestants had given the Nazis in providing an amplified stigmatization of the disabled? Here we circle back to Nazi propagandists' unapologetic self-styling as permission givers for the pursuit of pleasure. Okay, my final 5 minutes. 2 final thoughts. Aside from noting their shared derivation in Alfred Plutz's lethal, sexy, racial hygienic utopia, what else can we glean from trying to think the Nazis' cheekily provocative sexual politics and their violent disability politics together? One point that occurs to me is to note the extraordinary effort that went into presenting the would-be master race as perfect. Okay, the ruthlessness with which fellow citizens deemed defective were excluded from the right to form a family and bear children. But also, we have to realize this, the unbelievable elaborateness of both the administrative and propagandistic apparatus put into place to pursue that project of yearn for perfection. What all the effort shows is that the would-be dominant group was not and never is naturally dominant. The dream of being strong, healthy, beautiful, and smart was just that, a dream, implemented through brutality. As historian Gisela Baeck put it in her testimony to the Bundestag committee tasked in 1987 with considering reparations for what was called the forgotten victims, quote, I love this quote, the promised race, the master folk, was not a given. It was not the real existing German folk. Rather, the master race had yet to be produced. Or, as historian and Auschwitz survivor Henry Friedlander, explaining in 97, 10 years later, that budgetary savings on welfare costs, although promoted by the Nazis as a major benefit of their euthanasia killings, could not be the actual motive for those killings, noted, one doesn't build up a murder operation merely to save on sausage. But already during the Third Reich, the propagandists themselves fretted that there were so few ideal specimens to demonstrate what Germans should look like. A second and final thought, joining sexual and disability politics has to do with the tenaciously durable grip on post-war popular opinion of Nazi-inflamed prejudices towards vulnerable minority groups. Far from being simply time-transcending holdovers of traditionalist discomfort, the rationalizations provided in the first 2 post-fascist decades for why male homosexual activity should remain criminalized and why men prosecuted and imprisoned in the Third Reich did not deserve to be counted as persecutees of Nazism, and the justifications offered for continuing segregative and abusive treatment of people with disabilities and for denying reparations to sterilization survivors, both drew from logics first expounded in detail during the Third Reich. This is my point. Things were worse for these most vulnerable constituencies after 45 than they had been before 33. A main takeaway for us here is that fascisms do long-term damage. They are not easy to get over. They infect people's souls. There is no question that even as the Christian conservatives who came to cultural prominence in West Germany in the 50s relentlessly insisted on the moral requirement of premarital heterosexual chastity, and in this one way, manifestly reversing Nazi standards and positioning their own family values as the indispensable antidotes to libertinism indulging Nazi policies, those very same Christian conservatives maintained continuities with Nazi-augmented versions of both homophobia and eugenics, and gave them renewed moral legitimacy under Christian auspices. My final 2 sentences. As one young radical disgusted by the corrupt climate of the post-war put it, as he demanded a true break in 1981 with Nazi ideological formations with regard to disability, quote, after the destruction of the fascist state apparatus, the fascism in the heads remains. For him, one of the key ways to recognize any fascism was its evident delight in trampling on the weak. We have yet to take the full measure of this insight, which emerges from disability activism, and adapt it to our understanding of the once again these days, in far too many nations, recurring rounds of persecution, also of sexual and gender minorities. But I think we should. Thank you.